Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update and post-summit briefing, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we discuss the outcome of last week's meeting of the European Council and ask, is the EU united in these times of permacrisis? As always, totally interactive conversation. I will be asking some questions to start with. If you want to join our discussion, you can either write your question, click on the Q&A button, and please be as brief as possible, or click on the raised hands button, and I will unmute you when the time comes. Okay, Janis, kick us off, will you, with a sense of, obviously, the summit took place against the backdrop of the situation in the Middle East, and that was dominant in the discussions and in the mood and the atmosphere of the summit. But what precisely did they discuss in relation to that situation, and what other issues were on the table?
Well, first of all, they had an extensive exchange about the situation in the Middle East, around 5 hours. Which I'm sure we're going to delve into in much more detail. They also had an exchange with respect to Ukraine, with Zelensky also joining them, which has now become a tradition of the European Council. They discussed the budget review, they discussed the economy, the situation in Europe's economy, and migration. And by the way, there was also on Friday a Euro summit, which obviously was overshadowed by all the other things that were discussed and were on the summit's predominant agenda.
So let's dive straight in. We have a lot of ground to cover. Looking at it from the outside, it seemed that what the summit did most of all, Charles Michel heralded great unity at his post-summit press conference after that 5-hour discussion. However, what we saw was really an underlining of the divisions, the disagreements between member states over the situation. Where was there common ground, and where were EU leaders most divided?
Well, first of all, I think to speak of an immense unity would not be obviously portraying the reality among the EU 27. But on the other hand, if you take a historical perspective, whenever we've had an escalation in the Middle East, we've seen also in the past, and that goes back to the 70s, where we're still in times of European political cooperation, for those who remember. Whenever there was an escalation of the situation in the Middle East, the 27 or the member states, whether there were 9, 10, 12, 15, 27 now, always struggled to find a consensus. Having said that, if you look into the areas where there is a common ground, there is a strong condemnation of the Hamas terrorist attacks of 7 of October. There is an agreement that Israel has a right to defend itself, a right of self-defense in line with international law and international humanitarian law. There is an agreement when it comes to the immediate release of all hostages, a need to ensure and protect all civilians at all times. And there is also a worry, which is shared among all, that potentially there might be a regional spillover of this crisis, and including also other actors in the region, but also that there is a danger of a potential global spillover of that crisis. So these are all the areas where there is an agreement. Where there are severe divisions is with respect to what adequate response means to the terrorist attacks, what Israel's response should and should not be. There are differences when it comes to the level of support or unconditional support, as some member states say, towards Israel. And there are division when it comes to the level of condemnation of Israel's reaction to what has happened since the 7th of October. These are the major lines of division, which, by the way, are not only among the 27, but also are predominant in discussions within the 27 member states.
Indeed, I want to come back on that in a little while. I mean, Fabian, given those divisions, given the common ground, I mean, Janis saying there, historically, this has always been an issue that the EU has really struggled with. We'll come back to what we read into it about the EU's role in the world a bit later on. But in terms of what happened at the summit, were you struck most by the areas of agreement or the disagreement? And if the latter, how serious is it?
Well, I think what we've seen is really what you would have to expect, because this is a very contentious and also a very emotive issue, where different countries also have long histories which play into this. So the idea that we would have a comprehensive agreement between all the countries about how we move forward in this kind of situation, I think would always have been an illusion. So the difficulty clearly is that we have an ongoing situation, an ongoing loss of life, which requires some form of response. And I think what we are seeing now is, in a sense, trying to figure out, at least at a minimum level, what can everyone agree on, so that you have a certain baseline you can start with. But it already falls apart, I think, in the interpretation of what is actually happening, because different countries see it very differently, and it's an ongoing development. In a sense, you would have to have almost a summit every day to try to catch up where we are at that moment in time. The situation when we have full-scale ground invasion is going to be very different, and it will pose even more moral dilemmas, which are at the heart of this. So it's an incredibly difficult situation, and I know we're going to come back to that, but it also does show how difficult it is to be geopolitical, because it is a situation where many things are happening which shouldn't be happening. And how do you then try to get a consensus opinion? It's difficult at a national level. As Janis has already alluded to, we have a lot of these discussions within countries. And then if you aggregate that up at the European level, it becomes even more tricky.
Absolutely. Just wanted to zoom in on one of the areas of disagreement. There is a lot of talk, and not just within the EU, but much more broadly across the world, about whether the difference between those calling for a pause for humanitarian aid to get in and those calling for a ceasefire. In the end, the summit conclusions talked about continued rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary means, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Now, Spain supposed to be playing the role of honest broker because they're in the presidency. Some said they played the role of the honest spoiler because they had a very clear view on this, arguing for pause, not pauses. Janis, what was the significance of that argument?
Let me just add one point, and I'll come immediately to your question, to what Fabian was saying, because I think we also need to be fair when we look into the situation and the differences of opinion among the EU27, when having in mind also the difference of opinion even among those who are now most directly involved in the crisis. If you follow, and I try to monitor also debates, for example, in Israel, you have differences of opinion in terms of how one should react in the current situation. And this is just one example. Also, if you look into the Arab world, you have differences of opinion between the leaderships and people on the street, but also among the publics, there are differences of opinion. So I think we should have that also in mind when it comes to the question of how united or not united are the 27. Now, with respect to humanitarian pauses, yes, this was the point which was discussed most concretely. And there was an exchange, we were told, among heads of state and government, by the way, all by themselves with mobiles all turned off, about this issue. But at the end of the day, this stands for much more. It stands for the question as to whether one would signal or put pressure on Israel to stop, to have a pause in its intervention in Gaza. And here the opinions differ among the EU27. So if it would have said, and that's what those who were discussing the humanitarian pause, that could have signaled towards Tel Aviv, please make a stop, reconsider as to whether your intervention is the right intervention or not. Whereas others wanted to make sure that the level of interference from outside would be less.
So pauses just means don't stop and think, just stop, let the humanitarian aid in, whereas pause is more closer to a ceasefire. Am I understanding that correctly?
So you could have many pauses, whereas if you call for a ceasefire, that would have been calling on the Israeli government to do more than what is indicated by potential humanitarian pauses. Now, having said that, I think that is just mirroring the more general debates which the EU27 and the heads of state are having, and differences of opinion are having between each other. And by the way, I think it is good that we had an extensive exchange at the highest level of the European Union among heads of state and government. It took them 5 hours, but I think given the gravity of the situation and the differences among the 27, it is good that they have an extensive exchange and also debate and potential also confrontational debate among each other if that is needed.
Fabian, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to say that if we are talking about a ceasefire, I think this is also starting to get then into the discussion about what's the long-term outcome of all of this. Where are things going to stop? Because a ceasefire, you could argue, is much more about freezing the situation in some sense. And this is where also the Israeli government is very clear that it cannot be, from their point of view, that you just go back to the status which was there before, that you have that level of threat at your border. So this is also starting the long-term discussion, which unfortunately has not only doesn't have a consensus answer, I would argue it doesn't have a very good answer at all. There is no consensus which can be found between the parties of where this is going to end up in the end.
So if I understand you rightly, if you call for a ceasefire, you need to have some sense of what happens afterwards, whereas a pause, simply to let humanitarian aid get through, doesn't raise that question of, and what next?
It shouldn't raise that question, but clearly in the current situation, it is so charged and there's so much at stake for everybody that even a pause is controversial because it might arguably mean that one side or the other can regroup, can resupply, can change its position. So even pauses are very contentious. But if you're starting to talk about something which starts to suggest a longer term outcome, it becomes...
You have some answers. Yeah. Janis, the other thing, Spain, interesting to know why Spain was so, as I say, supposed to be playing traditionally presidency. You're the honest broker. You don't push your own point of view, but Pedro Sanchez was pushing his own points of view on the pause question, but also in calling for an international peace conference, which there is language about that in the conclusions. Why was Spain, why were they so keen to step out of that traditional role on this? And what could it achieve, this peace conference? Do we have a time frame? Would anybody at this stage, would anybody be listening to such a call?
Well, first of all, a couple of things here. One, Spain is among the 8 member states who in the United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of the resolution calling for a ceasefire, together with 7 other member states. So it is traditionally, it has a position which is more aligned towards a certain side of the confrontation, which now we're witnessing, but also what we have witnessed already in history in the past. So it is not a position which Spain is taking now, which is different from what we've seen in the past. Let's be reminded of that. Second, yes, they did not play the role of an honest broker. Given that they are in the role of the council presidency, this is something they should probably have done more. However, we also see that Sanchez, and that is more of an internal EU cuisine, political cuisine, is now playing a stronger role in the European Union, given that he is likely to be leading the government and continue to be leading it. So that also plays into it. But I think that he was also supported by others. The French president, the Belgian prime minister were the ones who were most vocal when it comes to the need of thinking of the day after, of having an international peace conference as is being now called for. And that is in line, by the way, also with the fact that we're seeing that there are more calls now, despite what we're seeing on the ground happening. And as we speak, there is an escalation happening about looking for ways to revive the discussions about a two-state solution at the international level. There is more pressure and going in this direction. We're not only seeing it from the president in the US, but we're also seeing it from many EU governments, but also beyond Europe, that their pressure is increasing to have a two-state solution. And I think that, yes, it might be now seeming very, very far away and illusionary, but at the same time, both the terrorist attack of Hamas, but also the military reaction to it, show and also question as to whether one needs more of a structural approach to what is happening in the region. Because going back to status quo ante, many would argue, including also, by the way, some of those who were negotiating on the Israeli and the Palestinian side in the past, whether it is possible to go to something which resembles the status quo ante, or whether it's not necessary to think more strategically in terms of finding a way out of the situation which has now been created, which is more systemic, and the two-state solution is now again on the radar screen. But, and I conclude with that, on the other hand, there are many opponents to that solution. Also, by the way, in Israel, Netanyahu is not supportive. The settlers are not supportive. But also, if you look into the region, you will see that there are a good number of actors who either openly or behind closed doors are not favoring this kind of a solution because they want the conflict to be ongoing. If you look into Iran, if you look into Hezbollah, and also some global actors. So there is the need to think about the day after, even if it looks extremely difficult from today's perspective.
Just wanted to come back on this point. I mean, my big question when you hear the EU at this point calling for an international peace conference is anybody listening to the EU right now? But that raises the broader question. We've talked about the divisions at the summit. Janis, you mentioned the United Nations Gaza ceasefire resolution. 8 member states voted yes, 4 voted no, and 15 abstained. Again, when Charles Michel says, look how united we are, I think it flies in the face of the evidence there. But what I'm wondering is more broadly, does all this mean, just sort of underline, just last month, talking about we've seen the birth of a geopolitical union. Fabian, you talked about this shows how difficult it is to be geopolitical. So does that mean that what Ursula von der Leyen was saying last month really has no credibility? Or is it the case, do you think, that given how difficult, and you've both underlined this situation is, and historically how difficult it is to come to an agreement, that there are particular reasons for this, and we shouldn't draw broader conclusions about whether we have indeed seen the birth of a geopolitical union?
I think the first point, just on your point about voting and that we have these obvious differences, I think it would actually be better if we don't pretend to have unity, rather than having these kind of statements, which are obviously not credible. And I think this just leads to a situation where also globally, and I think this is something we really have to keep in mind, if we want to be geopolitical, we have to think much more about how others see us, how others are reacting to what we're doing. So if we do have significant differences, then at least we need to be honest about those. And we need to say that there are differences which will be difficult to overcome. But that can maybe also be at times, and I'm not necessarily talking about this immediate situation, but at times that can also be something which is of advantage to the union, to be able to show that actually the union as a whole doesn't stand on one side or the other, but actually has a much more nuanced look at some of these issues. But in terms of the more general point about the geopolitical union or the geopolitical commission, because we had it very specifically applied to the institution, I think this just shows how difficult that actually is in reality, because being geopolitical means that you have to be able to react to these kind of situations. You have to be able to show that you can take action even when things are this difficult. And what we have seen is that, at least in my interpretation, that the member states have said that no, when it comes to these kind of questions, we don't actually want action. We would want action only if it is in line with what we want. And that obviously cannot be the case. So I think there's there's an incoherence here in the position of the Union. But that doesn't change the fact that we live in a world where we have these kind of challenges. So the need to be able to react hasn't changed. It's just whether we are politically able to.
Janis?
A couple of things. First of all, if anyone would have believed that the EU in a situation like this would have a united stance, and you were addressing the question to us following what the UN vote. So if one would have expected that the 27 member states would have, in a situation like this, have a coherent vote in the General Assembly, that would have been naive. And that's why I was referring to history earlier on, because our long history as a collective actor when it comes to the Middle East shows that we have almost never or never being united in the sense of having one position when you were in a situation like this in the past. Now, I'm not comparing the situation to past situations. I'm just saying when you've had difficult moments, we were already in the past not able to have one position. Second, I'm not sure. And I remember when we've had discussions in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, about the Middle East, that the fact that we are divided is always that bad when it comes to this concrete to these concrete challenges, because there are differences also at the global level with respect to how to deal with the situation. And if we as a collective can also show that there are differences also among us, that is potentially, if we play it smart in future, that is a big question mark. If we play it smart, it can also be used as an argument in favor of us, given that we, EU, have different positions also in our own in the own group of 27.
And
Last
within
point,
countries, deep
also within countries, yes,
over
deep
these
divisions.
Yeah.
And by the way, these issues also have repercussion on our societies, but we also see that in other countries around the globe, given the reactions which we're seeing on the street. Also seeing the level of anti-Semitism, which we're witnessing in many, not only EU countries, but around the globe. With respect to the geopolitical union or the geopolitical commission, I must say that I've always been critical when it comes to these kind of slogans. I was also critical when the Juncker Commission was talking about a political commission. So I think we need to be careful with these slogans. I would be happy if we would be witnessing what I would call a geopolitical awakening, an understanding of how significant the geopolitical challenges are now compared to in the past, and that we thus have to react to them in a different way than we are doing. We have been discussing about our reaction to Ukraine, and I think that we have, yes, understood the geopolitical challenge, but at the same time, we have not lived up to the challenge, to the geopolitical awakening, as I would call it. So one should be careful when using these kind of slogans.
Fabian, you wanted to come in. I then want to link this to the discussion on Ukraine, and then I see a hand up in our audience, I suspect, on this topic. But Fabian, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, it's a more general point, because I think what we should also not lose sight of is, of course, when you are in the middle of a situation like this, it's incredibly difficult to find the right way forward for everybody. And I think this is also something where we're struggling with in terms of our public debate, because clearly there are a lot of things happening on all sides which shouldn't be happening. So how do we deal with that? But I think what we should also be doing from a policy point of view is actually to recognize that this is part of the permacrisis we are facing, and that there are other parts of the world where we have potentially similar situations. And of course, they will differ very fundamentally, but I mean, in terms of the significance of crisis, the difficulties which come from that. But we tend to ignore these kind of issues until they fully erupt, at which point it is almost impossible to do anything constructive. So we should be actually doing the strategic thinking at the moment of what are the issues, the areas, the geographies where we could potentially have future crises, and start to react to those. And some of those we can already see are in turmoil at this moment in time. But I'm afraid we are very much focusing on this crisis. And again, we will be sitting here in a future update talking about the next crisis, and talking again about how we weren't prepared for it and how we didn't think about it before.
Yeah, linking this, and then Paul Christopherson, I'll come to you in a moment, but linking this to the discussion on Ukraine, as you mentioned, Janis, President Zelensky was there. There are concerns, and I wonder if you share them. As far as I'm aware, there was no really substantive move forward in terms of the EU's response to the Ukraine situation. Do you share the concerns of those who say that all this argument over how to respond to the Middle East, and indeed the scale of the challenge, will distract member states and diminish the appetite for continuing the support, funding and arming Ukraine? Do you share that worry?
I think there are reason to be worried. And we also saw that there were some heads of state and government, especially from the Baltic countries, who were indicating last Thursday, Friday, that we need to be careful, that we are not distracted by what is now happening in the Middle East when it comes to our efforts regarding the war in Ukraine. There is a fear that it might diminish our readiness when it comes to funding, when it comes to arming the Ukraine. However, I don't see that there is this danger actually in front of our doorsteps. Yes, there is a discussion, and we will come back to that when we discuss the EU budget with respect to additional means provided to Ukraine, and to member states being critical here, or at least not supportive. But I don't see that that there is a danger that we would, to put it very bluntly, forget about Ukraine because we now have to deal with the situation in the Middle East. But it is something which is distracting attention away from Ukraine. We shouldn't forget that. But what I'm more worried about is the international effects of the crisis in the Middle East, and how that might then have an effect on Ukraine.
Absolutely.
We see that there is huge criticism coming from the so-called global south. I have problems with using these terms, who are calling upon us being hypocritical. That has been something which we witnessed already earlier. Now it's becoming stronger.
You're a little shorter. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Paul
think it's the international effects we need to be
you
worried
had a
about.
question, Paul.
Well, maybe, yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Maybe more a comment.
Fine.
And that is that let's not over-exaggerate our division. For instance, if there's one point on which we have been agreed all the time back to Venice in 1980, it has been to promote the two-state solution. And that is clearly set out in the conclusions. And as Janis said, there are others, in particular in the areas, that are not that clear on this crucial point. For instance, when the Americans were pushing the Saudi Arabians and the Israel to create a sort of peace treaty against them, the Palestinians were completely forgotten in that debate. And that is one possible reason why this conflict started. Let's not forget either that the EU has been the #1 supporter of Palestine, in financial terms, of Palestine over the years. We have basically been supporting the Palestinian statehood.
Thank you, Paul.
I agree that today there's not probably very much we can do, but I think with this background, we have a possibility of playing an important role when we get to the point of having a peace conference.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take one more from also Maria Jardin. Hello, also, can you hear me? Doesn't seem to be responding at the moment. I'll try again in a little while. Isabel Ioannidis in writing asks, what does this new front in the Middle East mean for the EU's leverage and role in the world, our geopolitical might? I'm reading it because it's more, we've answered that question to a degree, but says, don't we look smaller than we were hoping for? So I think that very much really, you know, echoing the conversation we're having. Not sure we can add to that, but I'll give you a moment. And I see one more. No, I mean, yes, there was Van Ursel asking, do you have a specific comment about the unsatisfactory outcome for the EU of the UN motion last week? Very quick ones, because we do need to move on to the budget and other issues. Fabian.
I think what we're seeing is what we have observed for quite a while, that the world is getting much more polarized, much more fragmented, much more challenging on a number of dimensions. And this also has a big impact on the ability of the EU. And we are seen by countries in the developing world, in the emerging world, increasingly critical. That also has to do with how the war against Ukraine is seen around the world. I think this is clearly a trend, but what it does also mean, at least what it should mean, is that we engage much more, that we have these conversations, that we also talk with the rest of the world about their concerns, because there are many things which are being affected by the current situation, including, for example, migration, including food, including energy. Okay. And we don't really have very good answers. So just to and I know we need to be brief, but just to say, there is a big question of what is going to happen to Palestinian refugees. So what is our answer to that? Are we going to accept them into Europe, knowing also that certain parts of that population are more radicalized now? So these are very real questions which come from this much more challenging situation. But the situation is not going to get easier.
No, absolutely. I'm sorry. We really do need to move on now. Janis, you mentioned the funding for Ukraine. There was the other big issue that dominated the summit was this discussion about the EU budget because of a Commission proposal for a substantial amount of extra money. What's the Commission asking for, and why does it say it needs the extra money?
Well, the basic logic which the Commission is applying is that it states the obvious, which is that the world has changed over the past years, that actually we need at the European level more money in order not only to support Ukraine. The Commission here is asking for 50 billion, 17 billion in grants, 33 billion in loans, by the way. But it's also asking for more money, which is required in order to cover the rising costs of paying off the EU's joint debt. It is asking for more money when it comes to migration. It is asking for more money when it comes to investments to retain the EU's industrial bases or edge. And there's also calls to increase the EU budget, given that we're already seeing the effects of climate change in extreme weather conditions. So the support for member states which suffer from that. So that's around 100 billion, which the Commission is asking, given the new realities and given the specific challenges which we're facing.
And the reaction from
And
member
by the
states,
way,
Yeah.
Ursula von der Leyen said, and this is the bare minimum of what we actually need. And
Okay.
the reaction from the member state, well, first of all, it is not homogeneous. It's not that all 27 are having the same position, obviously. We have a group of, we've always been calling them the frugals, led by the Germans, the Swedish, the Danes, the Austrians, the Dutch, who are saying, let's look for savings in the existing budget. The Swedes even doing an exercise of what it would mean if we would shave existing programs and how much money we could then gain from that. So there is a big group of countries which is saying, Commission, be more realistic, look for where you can cut expenditure elsewhere, where you could redeploy, the word used by—
But also countries, as I understand it, saying, we won't agree Ukraine money if you don't also agree some of this other additional funding, like Greece, for example.
Well, not only Greece. You also have those who are opposing more money for Ukraine, in this case, the Hungarian government and the Slovak government, the new Slovak leadership, which is critical even when it comes to Ukraine. And obviously, the Hungarians clearly have in mind of how they can liberate other money which they are asking and want to receive from Brussels. And then you have those who say, like the Italians and the Greeks, who say we definitely need more money on migration. The Portuguese and the Greeks, who are strongly affected by climate change consequences. So you have different positions among the member states. But when it comes to Ukraine, at the end of the day, with the exception of the two, there is at least an agreement that the money needs to be found. The question is how it will be found.
Indeed. Fabian, some member states were pretty critical of the Commission, arguing that it hadn't done its homework properly. The Danes produced a report saying they'd found 16 billion of unallocated funding, which the Commission could use. They asked for more realism, saying we're cutting national budgets at the moment. Why should we give the EU more? They're asking for increases in salaries, sort of a little bit, are they crazy at a time like this? Was that criticism of the Commission justified, do you think?
I'm sure that some of the criticism is justified. There are always ways of looking for more money. But I think we are in danger, once again, of being lost in detail rather than looking at the big picture. And unfortunately, this seems to be always the case when we start talking about money. The question for me has to be, let's identify what our common priorities are, and then talk about how do we actually achieve those. And money might be one of the options, and that money might be at the European level, it might be at the national level, it might be helping businesses to invest in particular areas. But I think if we are just having a discussion around a certain pot of money, there will always be the argument about, can we not reduce that? Can we not save money?
Okay, let me put it in another way to you then. Do you think it is possible for the European Union to live up to the many challenges posed by the permacrisis without additional money? Because started Janis by saying, well, Ursula von der Leyen said that the world has changed. There are reasons why we need this increase. I mean, is the lack of realism, if you like, on the side of the member states then, not the Commission?
Well, I think it is, for me, absolutely clear that we are not going to be able to address all the challenges we are facing without significant investment across the board. But that doesn't necessarily mean that has to be in the EU budget. There can also be other ways of addressing this. But I think the reality is that we have a very significant increase in pressures, which is also resulting in budgetary pressures. But what I would also say, and this is again not part of the debate at the moment, but it's coming back to the question of trade-offs. We aren't going to be able to do everything we want to do. I think that's also clear. So we have to say, what's going to give? Where are we going to invest less? if they are priorities. And rather than having this rather old debate about do we cut a few billion here and do we increase this a little bit, we should have a much more fundamental debate and also start thinking about, are there big chunks of money which maybe need to be revised completely, also starting to look ahead of what kind of budget are we going to need when we are having the enlargement which everyone is talking about. Is the kind of agricultural policy we have at the moment still appropriate for a world where we have Ukraine as a member state? I mean, these are more fundamental questions, but the one thing I'm pretty sure about is that we're not going to touch them because they're even more difficult.
Indeed.
I think this is where we're politically just trying to avoid having more disunity.
Janis, a thought on that, and just in terms of, I mean, I've seen some speculation about the sort of areas of spending that could be most affected, and going to Fabian's point about what do we need to spend money on, seen suggestions it could be Horizon Europe, so research and innovation, could be green and digital technologies, at the core of what this Commission's Green Deal has been all about. Where, I mean, even seeing suggestions from the Commission up to 30% of spending on some programs. Is it that dramatic? And for you, can the EU deliver without additional resource?
Well, I think the answer to that is clear. Given the level of the needs and the challenges we're facing collectively, right? And we need to, first of all, agree that we collectively are facing these challenges that also need to be reflected in the budget. But Fabian is right. What we're seeing are the old reflexes. We see member states arguing we need to cut budgets at home. So you Commission, you EU also need to be cutting expenditure on your side and look for which areas you can cut so that we can put the additional funding we need to put into the priorities which we have. And you can see what these acute priorities are in the figures: Ukraine, migration, and our industry, the future of our industry. So that's where we immediately think we need to invest more money. And the question is where we find it. The other question, and that's the broader one, is actually how do we prepare ourselves for the longer term future? And that is the question of what will happen with respect to the pre-enlargement review, the budgetary review, the policy review, but also the governance review, which needs to take place. And where that discussion will lead us towards in future when it comes to also when we talk about the next MFF and not about now coming up with additional funds which we need in order to cover still the current MFF. So there's a still bigger debate which we still have to have.
Thank you. And just very quickly, the conclusions say the European Council invites the Council to take work forward with a view to reaching an overall agreement by the end of the year. Given the depth of divisions you've just been speaking about, how realistic in a sentence, Janis, is that?
I don't know. But I think where there is pressure to come up with a solution, where there's the biggest pressure, I think that we will see movement. Whether we will have the final package by the end of this year, I'm not sure. The outgoing Dutch Prime Minister said we will not be able to manage until the end of the year. I'm not sure. But I think when it comes, for example, to Ukraine, there will be a strong signal. We will find the money we need in addition. It's just a question of how technically we will do it.
I want to ask very quickly, one sentence.
Yeah. I just think we should also not be too much focusing just on the EU budget. I think the potential of doing things in parallel is very high. So it's not all going to be going through the budget.
Indeed not. Indeed not. There is another question about Israel, Gaza. I'll come back on that, Moza, in a moment, if I might. But there are two other issues I wanted to touch on. And the first is the economy. Fabian, the usual summit language about long-term competitiveness, about a level playing field. The conclusions saying that the Council said we need to accelerate work on the competitive edge in digital and clean technologies, link that to the conversation we just had about the budget, clean and affordable energy, critical dependencies in supply chains, there's faster transition to a more circular economy and reducing the regulatory burden. Sounds like a lot more of the same as we've seen in several sets of council conclusions recently? Again, are we any further forward?
Well, I think what is clear is that, firstly, the whole question of competitiveness, the question of how does European industry perform in this more challenging global environment has come up on the agenda. So it is there is more focus on it, and the council is returning to it regularly. I think we will also see it quite strongly in the priorities for the next commission and for the new political cycle in general. However, I think what is also clear is that there isn't really any agreement on how do we actually do that. What are the means? What is the financing? Because when it comes down to it, trying to progress in these kind of areas means that you have to tackle the politics behind it. And that means, for example, talking about industrial policy, talking about state aids in particular countries, talking about how do we deal with the defense and security sector. There are many, many areas where competitiveness, when you start breaking it down in actual policies, is actually rather politically contentious. And one of the fundamental questions, which is always underlying this, is, are we actually willing to do these things together at the European level? Because when it comes to national companies, the instinct is that national governments act pretty much unilaterally rather than working together.
Absolutely. Janis, question from our audience on another issue that is in the summit conclusions. However, the question is, could you comment on the fact that the leaders seem yet again unable to adopt any substantive conclusions on migration? Indeed, one sentence that simply says the European Council held a strategic discussion on migration and took note of the recent letter by the President of the Commission. We discussed this at length at the previous update, and we looked ahead to this summit and about the possibility of a really substantive discussion. There wasn't one. They're also intriguing. After that sentence immediately comes one about the terrorist attacks in France and in Belgium. I know there had been a push, I think, by some countries to link the migration paragraph and the terrorism paragraph more clearly, but the juxtaposition is interesting, shall we say. Quick comment to that, 2 questions from the audience, and then I want to look a little bit more at some of the institutional questions raised by what we've been discussing today.
Well, first of all, following the extraordinary European summit that took place earlier this month, where there was an extensive discussion but no agreement when it comes to migration, in our analysis, we already had said that the likelihood of the ordinary meeting of the European Council that took place last week coming to a conclusion on the subject, finding a consensus, was very low. So one should not have been surprised. And now with everything being overshadowed by development in the Mideast, even less. However, there still is a hope that there will be a conclusion of the new pact negotiations. The outcome still being very uncertain. Let's also not forget that we had the Polish election results, so that also changes the perspective at the highest level in the European Council. That also needs some time to be consolidated for the Polish government to come in place under the leadership of Tusk. So there still is some time which is needed. What I must say I'm increasingly worried about is that the debates in the member states seem to be going in a different direction, in the sense that don't expect anything from the European level. We've heard so much about what will happen and it has never happened. Let's look for individual solutions. That is dangerous. That you have the momentum at the national level. Now, with respect to the link of migration and terrorism, yes, it was especially the government of Sweden which had pushed to make a stronger link between terrorism, migration, and other governments, member states strongly opposing to that. So in the end, we have the language that was found, but the Swedes were asking for more. And there were others, like the Belgian government, who was requesting for more precision when it comes to cooperation with third countries. So we see that the member states were pushing, but in the end of the day, we got the conclusion which we got now, which are very limited, which means that the issue is just still on the table.
Okay, let me try once more to take a question from Osso Maria Jardin. Osso.
Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm so sorry, but before,
No
a quick
problem.
question in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
Before that, I work for RUSI Europe here in Brussels, and I'm a project manager in a counterterrorism project. I was wondering if we can all agree that living in a time of permacrisis can offer an opportunity for the reshaping of the balance of power. Does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Western response play a role in setting the stage for attempts of sabotage of democracy and its appeal both at home and abroad? But also, can this trajectory can be reversed? Also looking at the loss of appeal, not only within Arab countries, but also in the African continent.
A huge question also, which I'm not sure we're going to have time to get into any depth on, but I'll give Janis and Fabian a chance to react in a moment. Moza Appelblatt, you also wanted to ask something in relation to the conclusions on the conflict.
Yes, thank you, Jacki. I came a bit late, so maybe I missed your introduction. Maybe all addressed the question, as it was said in introduction. I mean, to this assume that its position has been some
Moza,
kind of a cacophony of different opinions.
Moza,
so my question is,
we have a problem with your sound, Moza.
I have to. Okay, I go to another room.
It's all right. I'll read your question out because
okay,
we don't have very long. I see you put it in writing. I will read it out rather than take it live. And Moza said in the questions, he said, if all the member states are standing behind the conclusions and Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen's statement about Hamas at the press conference, has the High Representative Josep Borrell been sidelined? And that brought me to a broader question, which I want to come to about the Commission and some of the criticism we're hearing from member states at the moment. But just very briefly, I don't know whether either of you want to comment very briefly on Orso's remark about threats to democracy from all of this.
I mean, I think it's a huge question, and I think this is something which we also as a think tank need to look into, because we are not talking about isolated incidences. We're talking about a world where, in my view, democracy is very much under threat. And if you're looking at the global balance, then democracies are rapidly becoming a minority. And that will also play out in terms of how the interests of different players are portrayed. I think what we have to avoid for everyone's sake is that we fall into different camps which can no longer work together, because that doesn't solve the problems which we are facing. And in particular, it doesn't solve some of the common global challenges like climate change. So this is a huge problem which we have to deal with. But I think there's no easy or quick answers.
I'm sure we'll come back to this in future updates. Moza's question prompted also from me a slightly bigger question about all of this, Janis, not just in relation to standing by those conclusions, but the Commission and the High Rep have come under fire from member states on a number of fronts recently. There was Ursula von der Leyen's very quick visit to Israel, then criticism of Josep Borrell when he arguably went far beyond what the conclusions say when he tweeted that Israel's actions in Gaza are quotes against international humanitarian law. Some people saying he stepped beyond his remit. And the budget row, I mentioned that some member states criticized the Commission for not doing its homework, and Berlin saying it was surprised by some elements of the Commission proposal. And my understanding is always it's best if EU leaders are not surprised by anything that happens at a summit if you want agreement. There's also been some criticism over the probe into Chinese electric vehicles. I mean, there is a sense, it seems to me, that particularly Ursula von der Leyen, having had a fairly smooth run in her relations with member states, is running into some headwinds. So please do pick up on the point about the Council conclusions and Borrell. But this broader question, are these serious missteps by Ursula von der Leyen? Janis?
Well, first of all, I think we need to do a proper analysis of where we come from. We have a situation, we were discussing this extensively when it comes to the Mideast, where you have differences of opinion among the EU 27. When it comes to the EU budget, we have difference among the 27. When it comes to the remarks of the Commission President with respect to electric vehicles and China, we had severe responses from certain member states, including from Berlin, because also there are differences of opinion. While with respect to China and electric vehicles, the French side was pushing in a different direction. So I'm just referring to these huge differences between member states, because if you have these huge differences, it is more difficult for those operating at the central level, whether it is the Commission President, whether it is the High Representative, to express themselves, to take a position that is meaningful, while not having one or the other member states being unhappy, dissatisfied with what they're saying.
So there's nothing wrong with what they said. It's inevitable. You're saying.
I think there were mistakes which were committed. I think that Ursula von der Leyen also committed mistakes when she was not referring to international law, international humanitarian law, that she did not make these additions in the beginning. Now she's doing that. So there were mistakes which were committed. But if you have a difficult situation like the one we're experiencing, committing these kind of mistakes, the chances of that happening are bigger. But let's not forget the situation we're currently in. And there's a discussion as to whether she will get a second mandate. And I must say that contrary to what some had expected, in how she has positioned herself, she hasn't been very shyful. So she has taken position, which at the end led also to controversy. She could have been far more careful in order not to create these negative reactions. And when one expects that the potential of her getting a second mandate increases, and now with Rutte saying that the NATO Secretary General job might be interesting, that is, increasing the chances of her potentially having a second mandate, and member states are putting pressures on her to get something from her in return for their potential support in future. So that is also playing into the equation, which makes it very difficult. So yes, mistakes were committed. However, if at the central level you ask for more than what the consensus look is, and we're always asking for political leadership, then you're also provoking negative responses.
And isn't that the job of the Commission President to an extent, to always push for more? I think the question really was maybe tactically how she handled it in terms of preparing the ground. But Fabian, a quick thought on this before we close.
I think the general comment I would make, without going into the detail of whether it was right or wrong what particular individuals said, because it's also interesting, I think, to look back and look at previous instances of the permacrisis and see that generally things were said in those circumstances, but because most people agreed with them, it didn't create the same controversy. So I think there's also a question of the reflection of how much there is underlying disagreement. But the bigger point for me is it shows that in many ways, and I'm going to use a fairly strong word, but in many ways, there's a dysfunction at the European level when it comes to dealing with questions of foreign and security policy, because it is an area where you have to combine the actions of the institutions with the actions of member states. Part of that dysfunction is because also the personalities are not getting along, and that doesn't help in this kind of situation. But there's also a more important structural question. How can we actually make sure that these kind of processes work better in these very, very challenging situations?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. One question I didn't get to. Apologies for that, but we do need to wrap up. Just to mention publications, there is a discussion paper out today from the EPC on climate mobility produced with the European Investment Bank. Also out today, a paper on the ongoing debate over EU treaty change by Andrew Duff. Events to draw your attention to. Quite a week this week because of half term, but next Monday, the latest in our series of democracy reform conversations with special guests including Guy Verhofstadt MEP on Europe Reimagined, exploring European reform options. Next Tuesday, an event with the Commissioner Nicola Schmit on the future of EU social and employment policy. And next Friday, an event on this is the 10th, we're now talking, an event on the 2023 EU enlargement package. And we will be back later next month with another update. So thank you very much, gentlemen, as always, for your thoughts. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Thank you for all your questions and comments, and apologies to the person I couldn't squeeze in. And if you can join us next time, we look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.